In a rare admission, retired General Mike Mullen has disclosed to the media that our foreign policy in Afghanistan was in fact a complete and utter mistake. In fact, he first confessed this during an interview with Martha Raddatz on ABC's This Week. Let's watch.
I thought we could build the army and give them a chance to create structures which would run a country in a much more modern fashion. That just is not the case.
So when you look back on those years, are you really kind of beating yourself up over that?
Well, I am, yeah. What I thought we could do, and I advised President Obama accordingly, is I thought we could turn it around. Obviously, I was wrong.
You also heard President Biden say, look, we should have gotten out 10 years ago. We should have gotten out after they killed Osama bin Laden. You were there when they killed Osama bin Laden.
Sure.
You were the chairman. Should we have gotten out then?
I think in retrospect, yeah, we should have. I don't think it was possible for us to just abruptly walk away right after we killed bin Laden, but clearly we could have gone earlier than we did.
Did the mission fail?
I think complete failure, no. Clearly taking out bin Laden was a huge impact in terms of Al-Qaeda and what was represented there. I'm not inclined to just lay it on, yes, it was a success or it was a failure. I think we're somewhere in between.
Now, again, that was Admiral Mike Mullen, and according to Slate, Mullen, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff from October of 2007 till September of 2011, is thus far the only senior officer of that period who has publicly admitted that the United States and the US policy that he, of course, was personally involved in, was deeply mistaken. In fact, he says, quote, "It's hard to deny the evidence in front of you." Now, we share the fact that he is the only individual who has admitted the terrible foreign policy mistakes in Afghanistan. He is an exception to the rule. If you've been watching cable news, if you've been watching network news or any of the corporate media, what you're likely to hear over and over again is various retired generals, various members of former administrations think that we should remain in Afghanistan forever. We should always have boots on the ground indefinitely because we need to be there to prop up a government that clearly was so weak that it immediately started to fall apart as soon as US troops were withdrawn from that country. Now, guess what? Despite all of those awful mistakes, the one thing that I disagree with Admiral Mullen on is the fact that maybe we should have left 10 years ago, but he thinks we should have left as soon as Osama bin Laden was captured and executed or assassinated. But the fact of the matter is we should have never invaded Afghanistan to begin with, because the whole point was to bring Osama bin Laden to justice for what happened on 9/11. Well, before we had invaded that country, there was a possibility for that to happen. There was a possibility to avoid war and to bring Osama bin Laden to justice. In fact, let me take you to an excerpt from a piece that was published by ABC back in October 14th of 2001. They reported the following: the United States rejected yet another offer by Afghanistan's ruling Taliban to turn over Osama bin Laden for trial in a third country if the United States presents evidence against bin Laden and stops air attacks. Now, when explaining the Bush administration's rejection of that reasonable offer, Bush made clear that he didn't believe that there was any need to negotiate with the Taliban, to work with them, or to take them up on that offer. He says, quote, "There's no need to discuss it. We know he's guilty, just turn him over. There's nothing to negotiate about. They're harboring a terrorist and they need to turn him over." So instead, Bush decided to go to war.
Okay, so the exception proves the rule with Mullen because everyone is noting, oh my God, that's a military official and obviously a very important one, and a rare television segment, in fact, a unique television segment where they actually criticized the actual war, not the exit, but the war. Isn't that amazing that all of the rest of television never criticizes the war? Never says something as plainly obvious as, we spent 20 years there, and the entire time the Pentagon was telling us, oh, victory's around the corner. We got this thing figured out. With the Afghan government's in good shape. We rebuilt the Afghan military. They're gonna stand up to the Taliban. And they collapsed in 11 days. So shouldn't there be people all over television right now saying, what the hell, my God, the Pentagon lied to us for 20 straight years. The intelligence officials were horrific. The Pentagon was worse. And the defense contractors profited off all this death and waste. Yet it's never said on cable news. And even there, Martha Raddatz is kind of challenging Admiral Mullen.
Of course.
From like, whoa, wait a minute. Are you saying that endless war is bad? Former chairman of the Joint Chiefs? Yeah, that's what he's saying. In fact, he said in another case, quote, it's hard to deny the evidence in front of you. Unless apparently you're a reporter on television, in which case it's exceedingly easy. That's what they're all doing, wall-to-wall pro-war coverage, as all of us are seeing an epic collapse of a 20-year effort that apparently accomplished absolutely nothing in Afghanistan. Remember, they didn't get bin Laden in Afghanistan. They got him in Pakistan. That had nothing to do with the war in Afghanistan. And that happened a decade ago. But here, I'll give you more. Is anybody saying, hey, Trump for 4 years, oh, was he in favor of withdrawal or was he not? No, Trump did nothing for 4 years. Absolutely, positively nothing. Now there's some Trump haters, so you might see that here and there. 8 years of Obama, an obvious failure. Have you heard one person on cable news? Isn't it amazing that Fox News and MSNBC agree on only this? Oh, war is awesome. So we won't even criticize Obama for keeping us there in an obvious mistake. The most obvious mistake anybody has ever seen. Nope, the only thing they're criticizing is the exit.
Yeah, look, we talk about the financial interests at play, the war profiteers, and the fact that those very war profiteers happen to be the sponsors and advertisers for some of these major networks and cable news channels. So to give you an example, yesterday we were talking about how Boeing happens to be one of the advertisers for Chuck Todd's programming over the weekend. And so, and a long time sponsor for Chuck Todd for corporate media, basically. And what does Boeing sell to ordinary average consumers? Nothing, but that money does have an impact on the type of reporting that we see in regard to foreign policy. But there's another aspect to it, and that aspect is the access journalism that we time to time bring up as well. You know, whenever there are these panel discussions, whenever there are these interviews regarding foreign policy, they want to make sure that they talk to either a current general, a former general, one of the people that you're likely to see in the press commenting and weighing in on Afghanistan is David Petraeus. So I want to give you an example of what kind of opinions and analysis you get from David Petraeus when he's being interviewed by people like Katie Couric. Let's watch.
What kind of troop presence do you think should have been maintained in Afghanistan to keep things under control?
Well, we had somewhere between 2,500 and 3,500 troops on the ground, depending on your counting rules. Again, we had not had a battle loss in some 18 months or so. That's partly attributable to the deal that we did, very unwise deal that we cut with the Taliban during the previous administration. We could have crafted a sustainability being measured in terms of blood and treasure, sustained commitment. By the way, a sustained commitment would be the one that would provide the most solid foundation from which to negotiate. Part of our problem all along for 3 administrations is that we have repeatedly said we want to leave. And then we expect to negotiate with an adversary who realizes we want to leave and is not going to concede anything to us. We got really nothing from the agreement that was signed in the previous administration.
But there have been problems with the government and the military that was propped up by the US government. We've known that for quite some time now. I mean, there were issues with corruption. There were reports on that. I mean, the fact that everything crumbled so quickly as soon as US troops began leaving Afghanistan gives you a sense of how 20 years and $2 trillion later, that nation building project was a complete and utter failure. And what people like David Petraeus are calling for is troops on the ground indefinitely. That's what he means when he says a sustained effort. And what wasn't disclosed at any moment during that interview, or even in the description box in the YouTube video of that interview, was the fact that there are financial interests at play and that David Petraeus has a massive conflict of interest because he works for corporations that profit from these wars. And this is, again, something we've shared with you before, but I want to repeat it because it's so important even in this context. This is reporting from The Intercept. Petraeus serves on the board of Optiv Security, a large cybersecurity firm that contracts with the Defense Department and is a partner of KKR & Co., a global private equity firm with assets in the defense sector. He called the Afghanistan withdrawal a Dunkirk moment on Fox News and told BBC, quote, "We should literally reverse the decision," adding, quote, "I fear we would come to regret the decision, and we already are. There are no good outcomes unless the United States and its allies recognize that we made a serious mistake." So I just don't get it. I don't get it. It should be disclosed that David Petraeus has this massive conflict of interest and should not be weighing in on something, especially when he's calling for, permanent troops on the ground in Afghanistan that he stands to profit off of.
Guys, look, the minute you say obvious things, mainstream media becomes a joke. It becomes crystal clear. So, for example, Petraeus said we needed a sustained commitment. Don't you think a normal follow-up would have been, we were there for 20 years. What would you consider a sustained commitment? 100 years, 200 years? How many years did you want to stay in Afghanistan if 20 years is not a sustained commitment? And he said, well, they didn't want to negotiate with us, the Taliban, because they realized that we were going to leave. Well, what was the alternative? Well, we're going to stay in their country forever? I don't know if you know this, Afghanistan is not the 51st state. Obviously, I hope obviously, we were going to leave at some point. But since Petraeus works for defense contractors, he says no. Basically, he's saying right there, we should never leave. And the media applauds. Yay, we should never leave. Look here, our members are already writing in. It's a funny handle, but Time Potato wrote in. I live in a neighborhood where a lot of Congress people live. If I watch CNN or MSNBC, I get advertisements for weapon systems. Of course you do. Okay, why? Are you gonna buy a weapon system? You're not gonna buy a weapon system. They're doing it so that the press will go, yeah, war kicks ass, right? By the way, did they tell you all these outrageous things? Fred Kaplan, a great writer at Slate, we've been using him for over 20 years to cover foreign policy and wars and stuff. And we don't always agree, but he has the facts. And in this case, he wrote about, hey, you remember that time that the high-level Afghan officials embezzled $850 million, all taxpayer money, US taxpayer money, $850 million. And the administration chose not to prosecute. So then everybody knew this is a joke. They're just gonna rob all of our money, they're gonna take it, and then we're gonna build all these weapons, and we're gonna give it to the Afghan military and the government. We know the Taliban is eventually gonna take it because this government's a joke. They all knew it, Even Lindsey Graham has quotes saying what a joke it is and that you couldn't possibly do it. So has the media in this moment where they are talking nonstop about Afghanistan said, obviously nation building doesn't work, obviously, right? Nope, zero. The closest we could find was that Admiral Mullen clip. That's why we shared it for you, with you. There's nothing else, wall-to-wall propaganda that endless wars are great. They're not manufacturing news, they're manufacturing consent. That's what cable news, and look, everybody under 40, I'm preaching to the choir here. You guys all know cable news is a joke news, right? Fox News does one style propaganda, but so does CNN, MSNBC. The establishment media does a different kind of propaganda. And in this case, it's for endless wars. But people above 45 think that these guys are gods. Oh my God, what did Don Lemon say? Jake Tapper and Rachel Maddow, oh my God, they're so great. Who should I vote for? Vote against Nina Turner? I'll definitely do it. Whatever you tell me to do, I'll vote against progressive. Vote against Bernie Sanders, I definitely. Vote for endless war, I love it. And by the way, what does that affect? Honestly, it mainly affects older Democratic voters. So the right wing realizes they're full of crap. The progressives and young people realize they're full of crap. And I don't mean to indict all older Democratic voters. There's wonderful activists in that group that are part of our audience and great. But look, guys, everybody in power still thinks these guys are doing news. I know to the rest of us it seems unbelievable, but these are the guys who run the country.
I just also find it fascinating that most of the conversation on corporate media has focused on whether or not we should have withdrawn from Afghanistan. But while they pretend to be concerned about the people of Afghanistan, it's telling that they don't really focus much of their coverage on what should happen to Afghan refugees. They might mention it here or there, but to me, it speaks volumes that most of the conversation is about, oh, we need to protect Afghan people by making sure there are troops on the ground permanently. If you care about Afghan people, if you care about those who have suffered as a result of this war or who suffer as a result of the Taliban, why aren't we having more of a conversation about increasing the number of refugees that we're willing to admit into the country? It's because they don't actually care about the people of Afghanistan, and that was also abundantly clear as drone strikes were taking out entire families of civilians on the ground.
Yeah.
So,
look, I'm saying one last thing, and I'll give the members the last comments here. But the mask is off, basically. So no one could see the coverage on television of Afghanistan and think, oh, this is fair news. This is objective news, talking about the 20-year failure of the Pentagon, the 20-year failure of nation building. It collapsed in 11 days. It turns out every general we've ever had on here and almost every politician we've ever had on our television airwaves has been lying to us. And we found the quotes, we played them for you the last couple of weeks. All the generals, all the politicians, all wrong. Yet no one on television is saying it. All they're doing is criticizing the exit. And so now you see it with great certainty that they too have an alternate reality. There's a Trump alternate reality, there's the establishment alternate reality, and then there are obvious facts. So last words to the members. And if you're a member, we read your comments and you're part of the show. I am Stock Wrightson. Remember how the media said that Donald Trump officially became president when he dropped the Moab, the mother of all bombs? Yeah, I do remember that. And I remember Brian Williams on MSNBC talking about the beautiful bombs. And that was in relationship to Syria, I believe. But whenever presidents are dropping bombs, even Trump, they're like, bravo, bravo, murder them, right? Did it ever get you anything? Never, and they never discuss it. And finally, Jedi Mullet 77 says, for those who wanted to stay in Afghanistan forever, need to be asked, how are we going to pay for it? Never asked, not once, by the mainstream media, because they're not doing news, they're doing compliance. Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR, so those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.